My name is Gian Wild. I'm the Director of Accessibility Oz. I've been in the accessibility industry since 1998. I worked on the very first Australian accessible website, and I also spent 6 years with the W3C writing the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 2. Don't blame me for them, I know they're incredibly complicated. One of the reasons I don't really work with the working group any longer is because I had a real problem with how complex those guidelines were. Now, if you want to follow along, or if you want to download my slides later, and I've referred a whole bunch of things during the presentation, you can access them all by going to a11yoz.com/Joomla, and if you log in, I think you can download the slides and take them with you and things like that. So this is my team, or it was my team a few months ago. One of the things that is a requirement in my business is that we mimic the percentage of people with disabilities in the population in our own organisation. So 20% of the population has some kind of significant disability that affects their daily life, and in my organisation at the moment 35% of us have some kind of disability. But you wouldn't know that to look at us. It's basically, disability is very often hidden in plain sight. One person uses a speech-to-text program to fill in forms and things like that. Another uses an online magnifier. Another gets epilepsy, and I get migraines, which is not seen as a disability, but is affected by an inaccessible website. So I've had migraines triggered 3 or 4 times by watching videos that have got flickering in them. If you're interested in that, I wrote an article for SitePoint about 8 steps to creating an accessible video, and it talks a little bit about flickering there, and this case in Japan where a couple 100,000 kids were actually hospitalised because their Pokemon TV show had flickering in it. So the thing to remember is it's not just about vision impairments. Most people think when it comes to web accessibility that it's about people who are blind and it's about screen reader users. That's not really the case. In Australia, there's 200,000 to 300,000 people with vision impairments. There are 2 million people with cognitive or reading impairments. That doesn't mean an intellectual impairment. It doesn't mean someone with low IQ. It means someone who might have difficulty reading or dyslexia or something like that. So today we're going to talk. I don't understand why it's so slow. I click it and it takes 5 seconds to load. Today we're going to talk about what you do when you build a site and how you make sure you prioritise accessibility during the build of that site. I'm going to talk about a whole bunch of different things. Some of them won't be applicable. I know this is very much a developer conference, but it might help you if you're going for a tender, especially with a government department, to kind of preempt what it is that they're going to ask you for. So there are things like conditions in the RFQ, choosing the right people, reviewing functional specifications, design evaluation, reviewing the web style guide, template evaluation, developer and content author training and other training as required, and a final site audit. So that's basically the kind of the core tasks that need to be undertaken when you build an accessible website. And we've done that with a number of different organisations. Most recently with Anti-Discrimination Commission Queensland, and they just won the Queensland Government Australian Web Award. So you can create a visually pleasing, clever, useful website and that site actually is AAA. So it can be done, but it is something that you need to think about throughout the process. So the kind of things that people will look for in terms of RFQ is that the site's going to be tested at key times, design, template, launch, for accessibility compliance, and most of the time they're going to require that if and they usually have an independent accessibility consultant, if that independent consultant finds a problem, that they'll expect the developers to fix those errors free of charge. There's a pretty standard requirement now that any websites that you build, specifically for government, will need to meet AA, so it's just kind of a requirement now. So if you are providing them something that doesn't meet that level, then they're going to expect you to fix it and not to charge them for it. Examples of previous accessible websites. My company, not Accessibility Oz, my previous company, was actually the Melbourne 2006 Commonwealth Games Accessibility Consultancy. and we worked with them for over 2 years. And we worked with them very closely in choosing their web development firm, and they had a short list of 6 organisations, and we basically said of the 6 there's only one that knows anything about accessibility. And it actually came, when we're talking back 8 years ago, came back to the fact that every other organisation was using tables for layout, and the organisation that we chose were using style sheets. So it's they will look at those kind of things. So if you have websites that you've made accessible, make sure you tell your people that. Otherwise they're going to just look at everything and you might not have actually prioritised accessibility and everything. So make sure they'll ask you how you intend to make the website accessible, such as, have the developers undertaken any accessibility training or accessibility certification, which doesn't actually exist. So that's a really good indication that your client doesn't actually know what accessibility is about, because you cannot be certified in accessibility compliance. So there are a whole different bunch of organisations, including my own, that run training. We're endorsed by the Australian Web Industry Association, so people that have attended some of our training courses and got a good exam mark will end up being endorsed, and they can tell that to potential employers, but there's no certification. They'll be talking about whether they're engaging an in-house person to look at their accessibility. Most often it's an external person that looks at their accessibility. They're going to want to know what accessibility testing tools you're going to use, and it's not really enough to say, well, it's definitely not enough to say, we'll test it with the W3C HTML validator, because validation in a really complicated way is not actually a requirement for WCAG 2, and even if it was a requirement, it's one of 64. So, saying that you're going to do that is, kind of moot. And testing with people with disabilities, it's one way to show that you really care about accessibility, is if you say, oh, and by the way, we're going to, and even for an additional cost, we're going to test with people with disabilities. And we've had a number of organisations promise that to the client, thinking that they'll never take it up. And then, of course, the client says, yes, we want to do that, and they can't find people with disabilities to test with. So they actually come to us, and we put them in contact with various different disability service providers. It's really important, if you're going to use people with disabilities to test, that you pay them. And that doesn't mean you have to pay them as in an invoice, but you have to give them something for their time. They're not, they're not there just to help you. We give a minimum $200 gift voucher, so like a Coles gift voucher, or Kmart or Myer or something like that. Make sure they know their time is valuable, because it is. You need to know about your content management system, and having seen Amy Marie's previous talk, unfortunately Joomla has a few problems, but don't be concerned, because there's really no content management system out there that meets all the accessibility requirements. There's a whole set of different accessibility requirements that CMSs have to meet that are different to WCAG 2. Basically, there's 2 sections to the requirements. One is output WCAG 2 compliant code, and the other is CMS itself fully accessible. So there isn't any CMS in the world that is fully accessible. It's a question really of whether your CMS can output valid code. And when we're talking about things like to force authors to add alt attributes to images, that sounds like a really great thing, but what about those images that convey no information and should be empty? If you're forcing people to put alt attributes on every single image, then you're going to start having stupid alt attributes like space at image. Does it force authors to specify page titles? But even more than that, does it do things like automatically append the site title to every single page, or does the user have to remember? Because if the user has to automatically append the site title to every single page title, then you're going to get a mishmash of, ADCQ versus Anti-Discrimination Commission Queensland, dots and slashes and all that kind of stuff. And it's actually one of the requirements that you reference the site consistently throughout the site. So making sure that your CMS does that automatically is a really good thing to tell people. Does it allow authors to use heading styles, or is it kind of, is it like more prominent to kind of make things bold and 14 point? So with WordPress, for example, the standard bars that you see in WordPress are just bold, 14 point, etc., etc. It's only when you say show the kitchen sink do you see the option for heading styles. It should be the other way around, you know. Does it allow authors to specify table headers? Now, if not, it's not the end of the world, but be wary. There are a number of one CMS out there, Sitecore, which actually codes table headers incorrectly. So you've got a whole bunch of people using this CMS being told that it's fully accessible and that they're doing the right thing, they're specifying table headers, and yet the actual CMS outputs incorrect code. And I was recently working with a client, they had a choice between CMSs, and that was the one reason Sitecore wasn't chosen as that CMS. So, and another thing, and it's a little bit confusing, but at level A, if you really delve into level A, you need to code quotations. So for example, Jane says, quote, "It was a great day at JoomlaDay, I want to go again," end quote. Those quotes actually need to be marked up with the Q element. Now that might seem fairly straightforward. The problem is one browser, as soon as you add a Q element, will add quotes. Another browser won't. So all of a sudden in some browsers you'll get double sets of quotes, and in other browsers you'll only get one. So there's a whole lot of style sheet manipulation you have to do. So it's not a lot of people know about that requirement, so you can certainly get away with not doing that, but someone might ask you.
So the reader won't say quote as it's reading it?
It will, yes, but it's more the user agents, Firefox or Internet Explorer, things will display it differently.
So visually?
Yes, visually. So if it comes across a queue, I can't remember which one it is, it'll actually automatically add double quotes. So if you already have double quotes in your sentence, then you'll have two sets of double quotes. But if you decide then not to have double quotes, you go into another browser and it won't have any quotes at all. So yeah, it's ridiculous. So we've started telling government to start asking some very specific accessibility questions when putting out their RFQs. So things like, what are the main accessibility requirements for forms? What are the main accessibility requirements for data tables? And we've started saying you should really think about giving people, giving a developer a screenshot of what you want coded, and then saying, what will the CMS do output? What does the author have to do to create this accessibly? So then we get to functional specification review, and so very often an independent expert will review the functional specifications for things like whether JavaScript solutions have appropriate HTML fallbacks. Now it is still, I won't get into it because it's a good 10-minute conversation, but it is still a requirement that your site works with JavaScript disabled. It's kind of like very 20th century, but it is still a requirement, but it's much, much, much more important that your JavaScript itself is accessible and keyboard accessible specifically. And quite frankly, there are some cases where you've got web apps and things like that where you absolutely have to use JavaScript. And you know, I will not be saying you need to create that in HTML. But in most cases, in 80 to 90% of the cases that I've seen, we see things like on-clicks instead of hrefs. We see really obvious things like form submission that really should be done in HTML. There's no reason why it needs to be done in JavaScript. Yes, form validation can be done using JavaScript, but form submission, it's very easy to do that with HTML. So other things like making sure that images that are not conveying any information are included in the CSS or can be given empty alt attributes, and hidden structural labels, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Video requirements, captions, audio descriptions, transcripts. So at the functional specification stage, you want to start thinking about where is that transcript going to sit on the page. The rule is the transcript has to be immediately after the video, or a link to the transcript needs to be immediately after the video. So you need to provide room in your designs, in your functional spec, and some kind of indication of how you're going to deal with that. Media player requirements, I won't get into it now, but we tested a whole bunch of different video players and none of them were accessible. Some of them had really, really serious accessibility issues, such as keyboard traps. So we actually ended up building our own accessible video player. It's called OzPlayer. There are brochures out front if you're interested. The video player itself is free for not-for-profits. So if you're working for a not-for-profit organisation, give us a call and we'll set it up for you. If you're working for government, then you can convince them to buy it from us. PDFs and other download alternatives, or download requirements. So PDFs, for example, are still deemed inaccessible. So you must always have an accessible alternative for PDFs, and that accessible alternative needs to be HTML, Word, text or RTF. If you're interested in the whole PDFs thing, I ran a session at WordCamp, I think, on PDFs and accessibility, and it's available. There's a blog post about it. You can download the slides and probably watch the video in the next couple of weeks. And then, of course, functional specification is the time to think about any additional accessibility features, such as increased, decreased text size, colour contrast picker and print buttons. So when we're talking about design, these are the kind of things that we look for. Reliance on JavaScript for form submission. So obviously we're not seeing the code, but if you see a form that doesn't actually have a submit button, then it obviously is reliant on JavaScript for submission. Appropriate source order, so changes that don't occur prior to the current focus. Visible field labels for fields and appropriate colour contrast. So here's just a couple of examples. So here, when you click one of these numbers, this content changes. So that is actually a WCAG 2 focus order change failure. So it's something that would pick up at design and say you can't do that. You need to have these at the top of the page. Here you can see this definitely has to use JavaScript for submission because there's no submit button. And here we see that this doesn't have a field label. Powered by Google is not particularly useful in terms of a field label. The other thing we look at is colour contrast. So red text on a grey background, I'll give you a hint, grey text on a grey background, they fail colour contrast requirements. There's some great tools. The Pacello Group's Colour Contrast Analyzer and Juicy Studio's Luminosity Colour Analyzer. This is the Pacello Group's analyzer, and it's just a eyedropper. You can pick different colours. The Juicy Studio one, and I'll make sure these links are on the present file. The Juicy Studio one, you add the hexadecimal values of the background and the foreground colours. So you can actually give that to your designer and say, you need to make sure all the designs work and run it through them yourself. Web style guide. Things like heading usage, alt attributes for images, table headers for tables, use of italics. Italics is hard to read, so don't have huge chunks of italicized text, summary text, etc. So then we look at the template evaluation. And so we look at things like coded field labels, table headers, coded headings, hidden structural labels, correct layout with style sheets disabled, form functionality without JavaScript, and use of HTML5 and ARIA. So this, for example, is something that we pick up at a template stage. If you have a look at this page, it's all this stuff about, you know, your account, etc., etc. You turn style sheets off and you get this feedback, you know, submitting an idea, etc., etc. Turns out there's this little, if you move your mouse to the right of the page, this thing pops up that says, would you like to submit some feedback? And if you click on it, it gives you a pop-up that says, submit an idea or blah, blah, blah. But they basically put that at the top of the page and hidden it with style sheets, with CSS. What that means is that when a screen reader comes along, that's the first thing that they're going to read. It's the first thing they're going to read on every single page of the site. Do you know how annoying that would be?
Is that on the Telstra website?
That's on the Telstra website. There's some, do you guys work with Telstra? No, good. I pick on two people, two organisations a lot, because they're terrible. Telstra and Coles.
And they won't be Coles.
And actually, for a long time, I'd say, oh, I hope there's no one from Coles in the audience. And at one presentation, someone from Coles was in the audience. And I was at the whole presentation, I was like, oh my God. And then afterwards they come up to me and they said, oh yeah, don't worry about it, we don't care about accessibility. And I was like, oh my God, I'm going to keep using you as an example. This is about hidden structural labels. These are really, really useful. These are for screen reader users. Russ Weekly did an investigation into screen reader users, and he found that the whole nesting of lists doesn't come across to a screen reader user. So the fact that these are sub-items of that is not obvious to someone that's hearing them read aloud. So what he suggested, and he did this quite a while ago, what he suggested is that you actually tell the user that you're starting secondary navigation, and you tell the user that you're ending secondary navigation. You hide it with the off-left technique. It doesn't change what the navigation looks like, but it's much, much easier for someone to use.
The reader doesn't pick up indents, or?
No. Just don't use visibility hidden, and don't use display none, because they'll be hidden from the screen readers too. If you want to see some examples, have a look at Transport Accident Commission, Anti-Discrimination Commission Queensland. This is a volunteering portal, volunteer.vic.gov.au, and I'll add links to the presentation.
That'd be good.
Okay, developer training. So we actually have a 2-day training course for developers, where one day we talk about all your WCAG 2 requirements and page source order and structure, titles. We spend a little bit of time on titles, headings and links, but not a lot because they're more content author things. We talk a lot about forms and tables. And then we have a half day on making JavaScript accessible and a half day on making HTML5 accessible. And those training sessions are available online if you're interested. We also have content author training, which is much more about using a WYSIWYG editor, headings, page titles and link text. There is one editor that I can recommend. It's called eFox Edit Live. It does output, if you've got really, really complicated tables, it does output accessible code. You can just install it, get it to write code, and then copy and paste the code into Joomla or WordPress or anything like that. So we talk about alt attributes, video requirements, content requirements, etc. And as I said, we have a whole bunch of other training. So the content authors often like the accessible word stuff and the PDF tagging. We do a little bit of ARIA, but not a whole lot. I'm not going to talk much about ARIA other than don't go overboard on it. Like, if you go crazy on ARIA, it's kind of worse than not having it at all. You only need really a couple of roles, like maybe 4 or 5 roles in a page, and that's about it. And video transcripts, captions, and audio descriptions. So the final site audit, we look at things like, and what we try to do, and one of the reasons that we can do it is we have our own automated accessibility testing tool called AusArt, and there are flyers at the front, and it's available for developers. We just start your site, we give you the results. And it tests for things like images having alt attributes, data tables, table headers, meaningful sequence, form labels, complex images, etc., etc. So we try, no matter how large the site is, we try, when we get to this point in web development, we try to test every single page, because almost everyone else out there will test a subset of pages. And one of our competitors tested 16 pages on a 3,000 page website and then told the client that they were 44% accessible. And I'm like, well, you can't say that. You tested 16 pages out of 3,000. So one of the reasons why we put a lot of effort into building this automated testing tool is so that we could actually test a 3,000 page website and not spend a year doing it. And we've actually used it on Museum Victoria, and that was 65,000 pages, so it can be done. You can't really see it, so download slides and look at it, but basically this is what an audit report usually looks like. Heading, what success criterion has failed, the level, where it occurs, the actual impact on users with disabilities. So what we find is you might have a whole bunch of errors, and they're all level A errors, but you don't know where to start. So we always say this is a critical error. There are 4 requirements in WCAG 2 that are basically, crash and burn if you fail these. We always label them as critical. Anything that has a really serious impact, we label as high, and then there's medium and low. Then you've got an error description. We give an example. So here you just got the URL screenshot, you've got code that basically the image is missing an alt attribute, and then what you do. This one is about using colour alone. So you can see orange means one thing, white means another, blue means something else. So it's really easy to sort of make something like this accessible. You just basically add a text description that says, these are the counties that do not have coverage, these are the counties that don't. This here is a keyboard trap, so you click on it, something pops up, but the keyboard focus remains on the page underneath, and so the user can never actually close this. And just a tip, don't ever use add this. Add this is incredibly inaccessible and it is a keyboard trap. This here is use of JavaScript behaving badly when it's turned off. So basically with JavaScript on, you know, you can pull this scroll bar up and down and see all the different items. With JavaScript off, the scroll bar is there but you can't move it. So there's no reason why this couldn't be an iframe or something like that instead. So make sure, if you're getting an audit done, that you include both manual and automated testing. And it should include things like a list of where every single error occurs, and that's what we can do with our tool. As I said, not many people offer that. And I do recommend that you include user testing with people with disabilities. I do think that we get different errors from them. Certainly we get a whole lot of the same things that we've already picked up with WCAG 2, but then we get something that really crazy that WCAG 2 would never pick up, but it means that they can't use the site at all. So it is still useful doing that. So these are just some example error lists where basically I'll show you can see the image is missing alt attributes, incorrect summary attribute. Here it says table contains masthead for website. It's completely useless as a summary attribute. If it's a layout table, you shouldn't use a summary attribute. Nested headings, unclear link text. You know, let's avoid click here. It's 2014 people. We've been complaining about it for a long time. Ironically though, WCAG 2 allows click here, but I won't talk about that. And you know, the other really important thing is make sure you conduct an accessibility review of the actual fixes. And the other thing that I would say, if there are any basically clients here, if you get someone to go through this process, the most important thing that you can do is make sure that if you get someone to test your template, that you also get them to test that those template fixes have been done. Because almost everyone we've worked with, we find exactly the same errors in the final site audit that we did in the template audit. So they're really, the whole point of picking about the template is to make sure they don't get deployed across the entire site. Make sure you can do everything you can to avoid accessibility complaints. So basically that means respond quickly. Even if it's a case of saying, we got your thing, we're not quite sure what we're doing, but we're working on it. Respond appropriately, fix the problem. You do need to bend over backwards when you get an accessibility complaint. You really need to spend the money, spend the time, whatever's required to make sure that issue is fixed. And also notify the complainant that you've actually fixed it. Don't just leave them hanging. You can do things like, especially if you're a government department and you're not going to meet the 2014 deadline, lodge a disability action plan. We've got some information on that on our website. And if you're federal government, make sure you meet the ADMO reporting requirements. There are also, I'm being really, really quick, I'll do 2 minutes. The problem areas, there are problem areas, so things like PDFs, videos, video player, maps. Google Maps, for example, is incredibly inaccessible. My own developer isn't sure that he could, given the time, create an accessible Google Map. So, you know, that's a problem that everyone in the world faces. So you need to kind of preempt that if you're going to care a lot about an accessible map.
How do we make an accessible Google Map?
You feel free to hire us and we'll build one for you. But no, I have written instructions on creating an accessible interactive map. I'll make sure it's linked on the present file. So I've told people what needs to be done. We just haven't got the development time to actually go ahead and do it yet. Okay, make sure accessibility is an accepted part of the content publication process. You need to think about 6 monthly or 12 monthly audits of content. Make sure you conduct training because quite frankly people leave organisations and you might have trained everybody up and then they'll leave. People that come on board, they might not know anything about accessibility. Everything I've spoken about today will be up there within the next hour. If there's something that I've mentioned that's not up there, feel free to contact me and I'll add it. The other thing that you should have a look at is wiki.accessibilityoz.com.au. We've got fact sheets in a whole bunch of different areas. They're free to use. They're available under Creative Commons. There's a developer version of each fact sheet and a manager version. So the manager version tells you how to test against it. The developer version tells you how to code for it. And it's got a whole bunch of testing tool fact sheets as well. I've also written a bunch of site point accessibility articles, and they're linked off. And I don't think we have time for questions. Thank you very much. I'll be around in afternoon tea if you want to have a chat. Thank you.